This is direct television from the studios at Alexander Palace. And now I'm going to see and hear someone you know well, Miss Helen Mclean. Looking at you from out of the blue. Don't make a fuss, but settle down and look it up.
It was here that television history was made. From this studio, John Logie Baird and the BBC together broadcast the world's first high-definition television service. The crowds who flocked to see those early pictures were astonished and craved more. Transmissions began in November 1936, initially to tiny audiences, but the news spread like wildfire. At last, television was a reality. Scientists had been preoccupied with the notion of television since the late 19th century. The principle of converting images into electrical signals and transmitting them over the airwaves had been described theoretically, but the technology to make it happen still didn't exist. Radio had become a practical reality by the outbreak of the First World War, and military demands led to rapid advances in valve technology. Experiments in sound wireless gathered pace, and in 1922 the BBC began a regular radio service.
National programme from London. Now you're going to hear the first performance of the new BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. It's just the time for dancing.
By the mid-20s, the wireless had become well established, but the idea of getting pictures as well as sound was still just a dream. For one man, it was the Holy Grail.
At a workbench in Hastings, Scots inventor John Logie Baird was experimenting day and night in the mysteries of transmitting moving images by wire or wireless.
When John Logie Baird came along in the 1920s, he was coming along just when the valve technology was becoming available, when amplifiers were coming out. And the thing which actually stymied the people in the 19th century was the fact that they couldn't have the electronics to capture the signal and boost the signal sufficient for it to be transmitted. So television has had to wait to the 20th century and for people like John Logie Baird to do it.
John Logie Baird was a prolific inventor and something of a maverick. Born in 1888, he trained as an electrical engineer. One of his schemes, an attempt to produce diamonds from graphite, caused a huge explosion and a massive power cut in his native Glasgow, and lost him his job at the Clyde Valley Power Station. It was a great idea, and in fact it's a process that's still used to produce industrial diamonds today. But like many of Baird's schemes, it was his execution that was lousy. He had a whole string of business ventures, ranging from his highly successful, if a bit dodgy, patented borax socks designed to combat trench foot in the First World War, to a disastrous chutney-making scheme in the Caribbean, and a somewhat prophetic proposal for pneumatic boots. But it was television, the idea that you could see by wireless, that was to become his abiding obsession. He designed a crude system for transmitting pictures by splitting the image into 30 lines arranged vertically. Extremely low definition compared to the 625 horizontal lines used today. In 1926, in London, Baird gave the world's first demonstration of true television. Within his workshop in Frith Street, he was able to transmit the image of a ventriloquist dummy called Stooky Bill.
The pictures were received with, mixed response, because they were fairly crude in those days, but certainly there was a step beyond where anyone had ever been before. People seeing live pictures transmitted from one room to another. It's quite magical in a way. We take it so much for granted today.
Baird's system was reliant on the Nipkoff disc, a device patented by the scientist Paul Nipkoff in 1884. It had 30 holes arranged in a spiral pattern, which, when revolved at great speed, resolved an image into a series of 30 lines. Baird adapted Nipkoff's innovation to convert the lines into electrical signals.
One great advantage of his 30-line system was the amount of information in the system was so low that it was equivalent to audio, and therefore it could be transmitted on the BBC's existing medium-wave radio transmitter. So he applied for permission to transmit his experimental TV programmes late at night after the BBC's radio programme had finished. He wasn't allowed to do it. He had a friend who was a BBC engineer at the time, and they had a clandestine arrangement one night where the engineer switched the transmitters back on, and Baird sent signals from his laboratory over the telephone line to the BBC transmitter, and they transmitted the pictures, and Baird received them back at his studio.
Unfortunately for Baird, his clandestine broadcasts were discovered. The engineer was sacked and the experiment shut down. Legend has it that Baird had already made an enemy of the BBC's first Director General, fellow Scot John Reith.
The BBC was efficient, and the people working particularly on the programme believed profoundly in the influence of broadcasting.
Reith was an austere man from a strongly Presbyterian background. His founding principles for the BBC, to educate, inform and entertain, are pretty much those that continue to define public service broadcasting today. But he had no time for television. He thought it was vulgar and without merit. Reith's BBC would have nothing to do with Baird. Baird refused to be deterred. He lobbied Parliament and the Postmaster General, and finally forced the BBC to climb down. They were instructed to give him access to the transmitters, which they did, at first reluctantly, unhelpfully, and at a price.
From 1929 until 1932, the Baird Company financed entirely the British television service, paying for everything. And the BBC sent them a bill of £5 for each half hour they used the transmitter. And after that, of course, in 1932, the BBC decided they ought to start taking an interest in television, and they started their own 30-line service from the basement of Broadcasting House.
Ah, so you've missed your train.
I suppose I might.
So began the great adventure for Baird, the BBC and the viewer. In those pioneering days, both Baird and the BBC produced programmes for a schedule that included drama, entertainment, variety shows with household names like Stanley Holloway and Gracie Fields.
It's absurd, I know, but if I hadn't been all cluttered up...
Because it was a low-definition system transmitted on radio waves, the pictures could be picked up as far away as Europe and North Africa, providing, of course, you had the right kind of receiver, or televisor, as the original sets were called.
When I was 15, I was interested in wireless and built shortwave receivers, and I thought it would be a good idea to build a television set. So I sold my Hornby trains and purchased a scanning disc, which we have in front of us here, which cost about 7 or 6pence. Fortunately, a family friend was Ben Clapp, who was Baird's first assistant in 1926. So he was able to provide me with information and bits and pieces. And I was able to get my first picture within 3 weeks of starting the venture in November 1933. They were sold in kit form, of which this is an example, or you could buy a complete televisor, as they were known, for about £25, which was something like 8 weeks' salary and very expensive. So 90% of the receivers between 1930 and 1935 were home-built. You could make a scanning disc, which is this, out of cardboard or ply, and you had to punch 30 holes accurately in the form of a spiral, because it was a 30-line system, which was less than a 20th of what we use today.
The BBC is anxious to know the number of people who are actually seeing this television programme. Will those who are looking in send a postcard marked Z to Broadcasting House immediately?
In those days, of course, the transmissions were late at night, when the BBC transmitter would normally have closed down. So you had to stay up quite late. It was only half an hour, and you had 4 half-hour sessions a week. But the great thing was getting a picture, because never before had it been possible for anybody to see an event as it was taking place.